All right, today we're starting something called trigonometry, which is a heavy topic. A lot of adults that you ask will remember trigonometry, and they may either remember it fondly or they may remember it negatively. But it's one of those things that kids learn in their math class that even if they don't always remember what it's about, they remember learning it for one reason or another. So trigonometry, we're going back to triangles. And we're specifically talking about triangles that have a 90-degree angle, which we call a right angle. Okay, so trigonometry deals with triangles when they're right. And remember, we had an A and a B and a C, and we had this A squared plus B squared is equal to C squared relationship. That's called the Pythagorean theorem. And that's related to trigonometry. What was important when we labeled the triangle was that C was always the longest side, and it was always the side that was directly opposite that right angle. And so C, another word for C, is called the hypotenuse. Okay? So if we're labeling a right triangle, then this longest side is always going to be the hypotenuse. And sometimes people will shorten it by saying HYP, and sometimes people will shorten it just by saying H. Okay? And so now there's two other sides, but there's always going to be an angle given. So let's say this is the angle that I'm looking at. Then the side that is directly away from this is going to be called the opposite. And some people shorten it by just calling it OPP, which was a good song in the 90s. But it's even better to just call it, or it's shorter to call it just O. O stands for opposite. The other side is called adjacent. Adjacent is a word that you hear. Adjacent means next to. You could say the house that's adjacent to mine, or the apartment that's adjacent to mine is the one that's next to it. So adjacent you could write as ADJ, or you could just write it as A. So now let's try. Let's say that the instructions are to label all three sides, and I give you a triangle, and it's a right triangle, and I have to give you an angle, and instead of making it theta, I'll make it x here, and I'll say which one. So now this is A, B, and C. You could be thinking to yourself, which one is which? Well, let's look for the hypotenuse first. The hypotenuse is going to be this one. That should be the first thing that you always label. Let's look for the opposite. The opposite is the one that's going to be, if I go straight away from X, that's my opposite. And then the adjacent is going to be, if I look at that angle X, it's made of two rays. We called these things rays back in the day. The ray is, the angle is going to be made of the hypotenuse and also the adjacent. So the opposite is always going to be the one that's left out if you make the ray of the angle. Want to try another one? Let's try another one. Let's go like this. Let's say this is theta. That's my right angle. Let's say A, B, C. Well, that's not really technically right. I wouldn't want to label it that way because it would be invalid in Pythagorean theorem. Let's look for the hypotenuse. What's the hypotenuse? It's opposite the right angle. That's this one. Let's look at what this angle that we're talking about, called the reference angle, is made up of these two rays. It's made up of the hypotenuse and it's made up of the adjacent. The one that if you go straight away from it, that's the opposite. Okay, so that's how you do these. On the worksheet, you're going to have to decide whether a side marked by, well, I guess I can do an example. Let's say I have an angle, and I want to know x right there. Is that the opposite? Is that the adjacent? Or is that the hypotenuse? Well, if I start labeling this triangle, that's going to be my hypotenuse. This is going to be my opposite, and this is going to be my adjacent. And so what does that mean? If I'm looking at, for example, this problem right here, what is that side? That is the hypotenuse. So on the worksheet, you could go down and you could find the slot for the number 1, and you put the letter C. You're going to put the letter C every time you see the number 1. And then this joke is actually pretty funny. And I don't usually just say that unless if I mean it. And what is the question? What's the difference between trains and teachers? You're going to laugh when you see the answer to this one. I promise.